Okay. Are we starting? Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, again for staying on, and it gives me great joy to welcome Nasima, Dr. Nasima Selim, with us this evening. Dr. Selim is an anthropologist, writer, educator, and researcher. She navigates the terrains of knowledge and praxis of health, healing, religion, and affective ecology in and across Western Europe and South Asia. She also does creative writing, nonfiction and fiction, reflexive, non-hierarchical pedagogy, and interdisciplinary collaborations inform her scientific and literary aspirations. Her current ethnographic book project is titled Breathing Hearts, The Politics and Practices of Sufi Healing in Germany. She is also working on a postdoctoral research project titled Who Has the Right to Breathe? The Politics of Respiration and More Than Human Life Worlds in South Asia. Dr. Selim is currently working as a team member of the Anthropology of Global Inequalities group at the Department of Anthropology, University of Bayreuth in southern Germany. Last but not the least, Dr. Selim is the co-founder of the working group Public Anthropology of the German Anthropological Association. It was a matter of, I would say, I was deeply fortunate. It was a stroke of pure luck to have met Dr. Selim within the framework of my ongoing show and all the conversations that have started and hopefully will continue in the days to come. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Selim, with this and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you, Savi, for inviting me. There is a title, and there are many texts, but basically what I will be trying today is a mix of genres, an ethnographic prose, a poem, and a science fiction. It's one of my first. But, so I'm a bit nervous today, but as you know, my breath will be uneven in the beginning, but then I have so many companions of breath here, so I guess we can breathe together and you bear with me. Before the word was the breath that made the word. The breath spreads through the whole body like a tree. The whole body is a plant of the breath. Hazrat Inayat Khan came to Berlin, and I am fortunate to actually have a photograph of him standing on the streets, I think, very near to Kurfürstendamm, not so far from here. And during my doctoral research on Sufi healing practices, this name was coming up again and again, and he had a lot to say about breath. Now, 100 years later, I met Pir Zia Inayat Khan, the grandson of Hazrat Inayat Khan in Germany, who was doing breathing rituals in an annual retreat. And I asked him a very simple question. Well, who is a Sufi? And he gave me a very simple answer. A Sufi is someone who breathes well. That sums it up. But what does it mean to breathe well in the circumstances that we're living today, especially in the necropolitics of war and air and breathing troubles in conflict zones, where the only choice is between whether to suffocate or burn? And beside of these suffocating necropolitics of war, there are also everyday troubles of air pollution and urban breathing disorders. So in 2020, and don't think it is during COVID, it was actually, the picture was taken before COVID, and that is what images do to us. These days when we see someone with a mask, we immediately associate it with COVID, perhaps. But this is a pre-COVID image in Kolkata back in February 2020, when I was there to do an exploratory field work about air pollution and urban breathing troubles. And everyday breathing troubles that are due to air pollution is not spectacular, and neither there is immunity or a vaccine, but this is something that perpetuates our breath, our lungs. Unfortunately, I had to drop my work and catch an emergency flight because, as you know, and as Pallavi has fantastically and very engaged way showed us what it did, COVID came and closed down, shut down everything. And I returned to Berlin. And in the last 2 years, there were a couple of things I've been thinking. And one of the main things was I kept returning to this proverb in Bengali, my native tongue, my mother tongue, "Jotokhon shash, totokhon ash." As long as there is breath, there is hope. And last year, Achille Mbembe wrote this very interesting invocation and also very timely invitation to think about breathing beyond its purely biological aspect, because much before this COVID, this virus came, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. So what is important is to think about the universal right to breathe as a fundamental right to existence. So in the last 2 years, as you know, we were immobilized, and I couldn't return to South Asia, neither to Dhaka, my birth city, and neither to Kolkata, my second home, and both of the places where I was planning to do long-term field work. With colleagues and students, we have been thinking a lot about how to decolonize collective breathing. And somehow Pallavi's exhibition came at the right moment, because we are having our workshop this month in March. And actually, I came to catch Pallavi, you know, like to get her for our workshop. And in the end, I got caught and very pleasantly surprised and very happily caught. So this conversation that Pallavi and I have been having is within the exhibition, and then over a dinner, much of our discussion went on. And so today would be more, not so much as a comment on Pallavi's exhibition, but also take this invitation and invocation to present to you some of my germinating ideas, conceptions, not only in terms of ethnographically inspired prose, but also poem and science fiction, as I promised. So this brings to the actual talk, much of the context, which is about companions of breath, and to think with who has the right to breath. Why only are we talking about humans? There are, of course, the humans who are companions of breath, but there are also more than humans. So I will actually talk much less about humans and more about trees. And that's why it's called A Tale of Two Trees. And in this adventure or expedition, my partner in crime is Debolina, who is a filmmaker, a visual artist, and a writer, who has been documenting for more than 10 years the effective ecology of a tree, a tamarind tree, in a southern Kolkata neighborhood, which is a kind of hub of refugee colonies of East Bengali refugees who came from East Bengal to West Bengal. So this is a common venture, and Debolina is joining actually as audience, because it's almost midnight in Kolkata. So I guess she hears me. So first I will read the poem in Bengali and English. হাজার হাজার দমের খেলা কোন কাহিনী আজ শোনাবো তোমায় একদা এক তেঁতুল গাছ দাঁড়িয়েছিল একা অনেক না শুধু একটা I have lived 1,000 stories of breath. Which one to tell? Once upon a time, there was a tamarind tree, not many, but one, last tree standing. দমের সাথী তেঁতুল নাম না জানা পাখি খুব জ্বালাবে এমন এক বাঁদর ধরা যায় না ছোঁয়া যায় না এমনই এক হাওয়া হায় রে মানুষ, রঙিন মানুষ, তুমি দম ফুরাইলে ঠুস। My companions of breath, a tamarind tree, an unnamed bird, a monkey troubling me all day, slipping through my hands, a whiff of air. Oh, humans full of color, one breath less and you're gone. So these are some of the images that Debolina has been taking, and then in 2019, when we were both navigating through this particular neighborhood, we were exploring its more than human ecology, and we kept thinking, like, how do we think of trees, and what do these trees think of us? And that conversation became a question of how do we breathe their breath and how do they breathe ours? And then there were other questions, because in South Asia, tamarind tree, among many other trees, has an iconic image, and there is no road that does not end at the base of the tamarind tree. And so we were kind of interested in this individual biography of this companion, this particular companion of breath. And we were reading up. I mean, of course, Tagore wrote about tamarind tree. I think Tagore wrote about everything. Anyway, and then there were other plays and dramas, and there is this social life of trees, there is this cultural history and logic of human-tree relation. But we wanted to ask different questions, and one of the questions that we asked was, well, who planted this tree, actually? This particular tamarind tree. And what we found out was a story of Parul Mukherjee, who was born in 1915 and died in 1990. And this amazing person, so this amazing tree brought us to another, one companion of breath brought us to another companion of breath, whom I haven't met, but Debolina remembers very clearly. This woman was going around with a big stick and like refusing to let anyone cut any tree or close down any pond or build another building. And it is suspected, we do not know, that this particular Parul Mukherjee, who used to be fighting against the anti-colonial British rule, fought against them, was caught, went to prison, became a refugee, went from East Bengal to West Bengal, and her cause remained, and she became, not only fighting for the right for others to breathe in a free country, free nation, but also the rights of animals, of trees, and of the landscape itself. Now, as we continued this journey, and then COVID came, and we started really talking about breath a lot. And one of the things that we started thinking about, well, we talked so much about this tamarind tree, but can the tamarind tree talk? Can the tamarind tree breathe? And this brought us to botany. And I have been reading up a lot of things about plant breathing. I mean, do really plants breathe? I mean, they do not breathe like mammals or like us do. And we all know that they take up our carbon dioxide and give us oxygen. But if there are a lot of carbon dioxide, they stop absorbing them as much. So just by planting more trees, we will not get rid of our human hubris. So there's a lot to learn about plant breathing and human-tree relation. So now comes the second story, which will be about how to think of trees as more than human companions of breath. And this story is made of migration, a dead grandfather, another city, a house plant, and the speculative imagination of science and technology. And I will read, so you will hear me for another 10 to 12 minutes. So this is where the science fiction comes. It's called Becoming Midori. Until recently, I considered myself more of a tree person and not necessarily a plant person. Definitely not a houseplant person. As a child, I knew all about creating fictive kinships with trees that stood out in the open, resisting time, weather, and human hubris. There was a grand tamarind tree in the schoolyard. I thought he was my grandfather, whom I never met. He lived and died in a small village of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, when my father was only 18. My grandfather was never photographed, and I never heard anything about his appearance. So it was easy for me to assume that he could be a tamarind tree. Why not? My grandfather was always sun-soaked, robust, and deciduous. Standing in the middle of the capital city of Bangladesh, he could not grow in the shade. He could tolerate drought, but preferred to spread his roots in moist soil. He could fix nitrogen and carbon dioxide, of course, but was known to be tender to frost, which fortunately he never had to experience. In Bangladesh, the temperature never fell under 10 degrees of centigrade, not even in the colded winter days. My grandfather offered barks, roots, flowers, fruits, and leaves filled with medicinal properties. My grandfather and I did not have much in common, though, because I never tried to grow barks, roots, flowers, fruits, or leaves. Breathing human was just fine. When I left school, my grandfather did not accompany me. After leaving school, I joined and left universities. I left my parents, my hometown, and the country where I was born. I arrived at a cold city in the north where the sun never quite knew how to shine. 3 decades later, I met my grandfather again. This time, he decided to be a sycamore tree, platane in German, Latin, Platanus occidentalis. He was still robust and deciduous, but he assumed an additional property. He could now withstand the winter of the northern hemisphere. My grandfather grew to the height of 100 feet and stood on 2 trunks. He developed bumps all over his trunks, a sign of his advanced age. One of these bumps became a gigantic nose. On my way to the workplace, I stroked my grandfather's nose and shared with him all my migrant troubles. Whether a tetul gach or tamarind tree in Dhaka, or a platane or sycamore tree in Berlin, my grandfather was a patient person. He listened carefully without offering me any intrusive verbal advice. Winter came, the snowfall never stopped. Unlike my grandfather, I was mortally afraid of the cold and begged for heating long before the heating period in the city officially started. My grandfather survived through the winter, but never recovered from next summer when the sycamore trees of Western Europe began to lose their leaves. That year, he fell ill to the anthracnose epidemic, a common fungal disease of shade trees that results in massive loss of leaves. My grandfather turned gray and died slowly, drying up from the inside. During one of those frosty winter days later that year, a friend brought me Midori, an evergreen houseplant, thinking it might help me mourn my dead grandfather. My friend said, "This plant is a frost boiler, very easy to freeze, like you. Hope you two get along." I said, "But I'm not a plant person. I don't know how to take care of a houseplant. She will die in a month." My friend laughed and said, "We'll see." Midori survived the winter, my carelessness, and the unfriendly visitors to my apartment. One of these visitors was a white German botanist with whom I had a complicated relationship. The botanist had the nasty habit of showing off her plant naming skills. Whenever she stepped into my bedroom, I introduced Midori, and the botanist rolled her eyes and said, "Midori, it is Schefflera actinophilia. If you have trouble pronouncing the Latin name, you can call it an umbrella tree." Midori must have been offended. There was suddenly a bitter and pungent smell in the air, and I felt nauseous. My botanist friend opened the windows and said, "Your houseplant seems to be angry. Teach her some manners, especially how to behave with guests." Midori and I looked at each other. Now I rolled my eyes, and Midori shot out a dried leaf with vehemence. I had never been a plant person, but I promised that I would not let Midori die. After the visit by the arrogant botanist, I decided to educate myself more in the science of Schefflera actinophilia. And I was curious about the local history of naming it. It turned out that the Germans had named her people way back in 1894. For the sake of Midori, I also thought I should get to know her people more intimately. So whenever I visited someone's house, I started scrutinizing their evergreen houseplants and asked them about their health status. These humans found me over-enthusiastic and plain nosy. Midori, in the meantime, continued to grow, radiating leaves, and I observed her with wonder. That is how we humans have named her people, actinophilia, with radiating leaves. Some of the descriptions of her people I found to be quite offensive, if not outright discriminatory. They say that a Schefflera actinophilia is an aggressive plant, since the members of this genus tend to dominate the soil. The humans surely know how to project their vices to the non-humans. I promised not to do that to Midori. Midori found her place in an earthen pot at the southeast corner of my bedroom near the window overlooking the city. After 5 years of living together, Midori began to drop her leaves last winter. First, there were occasional dry leaves on the floor, nothing unusual. I watered her and increased the doses of plant nutrition fluid. Soon she began to drop fresh green leaves. I started to worry. Outside the window, winter was raging. I barely went outside the house and observed Midori with increasing anxiety and helplessness. And in my desperation, I called my botanist friend, that one, who laughed off my worries. "It's winter. Even evergreen plants lose a few leaves. No big deal." But Midori kept dropping her green leaves, and soon there were hardly any leaves left. I stopped going outside, except to the grocery shop and the neighborhood plant shop. I sent a long letter to my workplace describing that a family member was ill and that I had to take care of her. I was not granted sick leave, so I quit my job. I did not sleep very well. I organized several fluorescent bulbs around Midori so that I could observe any minute change happening to her. One day, late in the night, I heard a drop. Waking up from my rare slumber, I saw that Midori had dropped her last remaining leaf. Enough is enough. I looked at Midori and shook her trunk with all my strength, screaming, "Midori, Midori, what is happening to you?" I looked for clues and signs all over her bare brown trunks and branches, and suddenly I saw pores, hundreds and thousands of them. These were probably doors to get inside her. I wished I could walk in, but my human eyes were incapable of seeing what was really going on. My human body too dense to enter through these pores. There had been a lot of discussion lately about the modern human world and the technology of species jump. Pet owners have paid a lot of money to get inside the consciousness of their pets, mainly to control their behavior. The technology is still illegal and did not receive formal government approval. So I dived into the dark net and contacted a species jumper. He said that the technology worked only for the human to animal species jumps. He knew only one person who ever attempted a species jump into his houseplant, but that person never returned to tell the story. I said I didn't care about the consequences, and I asked about the cost of a human-to-plant species jump. Lucky for you, said the species jumper, there is a darknet call for experimental species jumpers. You could apply. Because of the failure of the last human-to-plant species jump, nobody responds to the call anymore, so you might get the technology for free. I thanked him and logged off from the site to enter the designated darknet cell. I had to sign an informed consent that I was aware of the possibility of a permanent loss of my human consciousness. Then I had to drink 500 milliliter of a bitter green fluid named phytocommunicability spirit. It tasted like spoiled herbal remedy. I had to attach a microchip under my skin and another microchip on the main trunk of Midori. The local barber shop ran an illegal surgery room at the back for such procedures. It cost me a few €100, but I got it. The third part of the procedure was simply annoying. I had to sit on the floor opposite Midori with closed eyes and breathe. For seconds, minutes, and hours, nothing happened. Suddenly I heard Midori's voice. You cannot just walk inside me. It's my place, my inner space. You cannot take over. She sounded furious. I opened my eyes. All I saw was green. I tried to explain myself, but my mouth seemed to have dissolved into a semi-fluid mass. I heard Midori again. I don't need an explanation. Get out of here. Get out of my meristems right now. I did not need to open my mouth. Midori was hearing all my thoughts, and I thought, what is a meristem, by the way? But then stopped asking intrusive questions. And I said, I'm really sorry, I just wanted to help. I thought you were sick, I didn't want to lose you. Midori continued with a wounded voice, don't be so dramatic. I'm not your grandfather. There's nothing wrong with me. This year, the winter is unbearable, and so is your excessive curiosity about me and my people. So I opted for a radical solution of losing my leaves. But before you even decided to jump inside me, why didn't you ask me for permission? You behave as if you care about me. You read all about my family, my genus, my species, the Latin names of my people. Did it ever occur to you that trying to know me and my people with intrusive methods is part of the reason why I'm losing all my leaves? I wanted to send you a message that your extractivist expedition was not okay. I was too stunned to think, and Midori continued. Why is it so important to know me rather than learn to live with me? I'm not that different from you. We are both multicellular beings. We share our breath. It's true that even as adults, my cells inhabit meristems, the places where they can continuously divide and grow. They produce special cells, cells that you can only dream of. We are so much more superior than you humans. Do you realize that? I was speechless, remembering vaguely all my botany classes. The last thing I heard from Midori was, you have no business invading my consciousness. I don't need your help. You humans should rather help yourself. So I had to leave Midori alone. And as I receded from her plant consciousness, Midori continued to expand. And having lost my humanness, I was slowly becoming Midori. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Nasima, for taking us through that. I like the term unbearable curiosity. Yes. But there's so much to think about in, what you presented, both as speculation, but also as research, and the methodology that basically undergirds your practice. And I guess many of the people attending today would know, but also some may not, that your practice is also informed by your degree in medicine and by your practice as an anthropologist. And I feel that my question, I guess, or because this is a conversation that we are going to continue in the days ahead. We're scheduled to meet and talk about many more things. But I feel that, it's very interesting, perhaps even, provocative, to think about breathing in the framework of rights. I was reading the other day, I was revisiting some of Hannah Arendt's ideas where she says that citizenship is the right to have rights, right? And in the context of the panel just before ours, where there are all of these fraught mechanisms that structure citizenship, that exclude or include who a citizen can be, somehow the framework of rights becomes prescriptive, and produces its own violence. And I feel that the idea of the breath, which is almost etheric, but also material at the same time, it straddles that thin line between being an etheric force, but also being a material infrastructure of life. How does one negotiate this question of rights, which sometimes folds upon itself to produce very reactive, traces or residues around us in our everyday life? That would be, I guess, the first question.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you for raising this question. I feel that, going back to Achille Mbembe's work, and I think that was the inspiration to think about what would it mean to universal right of breath. And the reason why I juxtapose Mbembe's invitation to Hazrat Inayat Khan's kind of invocation, that who is a Sufi, and in a broader way, if a Sufi is someone who breathes well, and it not only means that you just, sit home, close your doors and windows and do some breathing techniques and you are just well, because the material conditions of breath, which are fraught with political struggles. And I remember you and I talking over dinner about Noor Inayat Khan, who is actually a very important figure to invoke in these times, because, Noor Inayat Khan is the daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who became part of the French resistance, and she was a pacifist, and she was a, a Sufi, the daughter of a Sufi and practicing one, a storyteller. But then when Second World War broke, she kind of just couldn't be a pacifist, had to engage. So somehow, I know I'm meandering, but somehow I feel that there is a spectrum between, very private, intimate, metaphysical breathing techniques of practice, which is totally legitimate, but if it is not connected to social justice, to the question of rights-based frameworks, then somehow we miss. And the same goes the other way. I think if we only stay with, inequalities and not think of inspiration, which is a very interesting metaphor of breathing in, but also taking in what is possible, I think maybe that is a corrective, I would say, that instead of either getting rid of the right framework or getting rid of the quote-unquote mystical framework, how can we bring healing and social justice and environmental justice together and talk about them on the same breath, so to speak?
Yes, I think healing and justice to be thought of together definitely as kind of twin engines of life, and the renewal of life. And one of the, as I was, I think, also mentioning to you, that Noor Inayat Khan is actually a protagonist of one of my, a body of works that I did in 2014. where I am also looking at the kind of, ventilation systems almost, right, that are produced, that are, these incisions in history, right? Because she's also a figure. So again, when we talk of rights, and what I'm trying to, I think, get at or push towards is, can we think of a framework of justice that is not premised on the rights of an individual? Can we think of justice in a more kind of, in the way that breath functions, right? As an osmotic process, as opposed to a process of membership. And one of the kind of, interesting things about Noor is that she's missing from modern Indian history because it is not convenient for, and she's also Tipu Sultan's descendant, right? And Tipu Sultan is the symbol of resistance against British colonialism. He's the hero of anti-colonial fight. And it is not convenient for a descendant of Tipu Sultans to become a British agent during the Second World War. So she's kind of, I mean, of course, now her legacy has been reclaimed by the work of Shabani Basu, amongst others. But for the longest time, she was absent from British history because she was not British. And she's absent from Indian history because she is not convenient for Indian historiography. And I think some of this erasure of the sheer will to life, the sheer will to justice, it's the erasure of Noor from the historical canon is also an erasure of that will, comes from this question of membership, or the anxieties around membership. Who is allowed to be a member of this imagination of a certain kind of collective, which would then determine who has the right to do what.
But, Pallavi, but there I think to include the more than humans in the question of rights can be a very interesting intervention, because then you there is also what is known as let's say, sort of nationalism played upon trees, for example. What is a native tree? What is a foreign tree? I mean, and we see those humanist tropes coming to trees also, right? But the question is, who has the right to breathe? I mean, I go back to the title, and if the trees have the right to breathe, if the animals have the right to breathe, if the air itself has a right not to be saturated with toxicity, so how to expand, and there I feel that this whole move to talk about more than human life worlds, and including within the universal right to breath, not only the human, but also the non-human, might be an interesting way to stay with the right framework, but coming from a completely different angle, like a tangential cut, so to speak, might be a way. I don't know, I have not just started this work, but I think it would be interesting to think like that.
Absolutely. I was really thrilled by your evocation of Midori as this kind of, irritated house plant. Because there is also the other side of toxicity, which is the allure of toxicity. Toxicity has its own erotics. In this case, it's the stress of the winter, which manifests as a will to shed. But, an equivalent of that would also be, for example, proliferation of certain kinds of species of weed, wild weed, because of the saturation of the air with certain toxins. Yeah. So the toxicity is also generative toxicity. It's not always a constriction. Yeah. And I feel to negotiate that kind of erotic charge of toxicity vis-a-vis the breath, and vis-a-vis not just more than human breath. I think also allows us to see the world as a series of proliferations, not just as a series of withdrawals or recensions, or something being rescinded. And I think that your talk really sort of also opened that kind of channel as I was trying to, imagine Midori.
Yeah. Actually, very interesting that you raised that toxicity as a proliferative mode, because it could also be that we may or may not be able to prevent toxicity from happening. Despite our will, our efforts, we live in a toxic world already. And so the question is, we try to engage with toxicity whether it's toxicity of the air or plastic, which is everywhere, including the stones these days, then how do we make it generative? So there has been art that has been made of toxic stuff. I mean, not to condone, you know, but to say that, okay, if the toxic is there, how do we transform? Or let's say engage with toxicity.
Or live with it.
Or live with it, right? I mean, if we can't get rid of it, then live with it. So I think what Midori says in this whole story, that why is it important to know rather than learn to live with me? I think for me as an anthropologist, this was kind of my alter ego, the plant. I actually have a house plant named Midori, and one winter evening I was really looking at her. What would she say to me? Bloody winter in Berlin, and then other stuff. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm a notorious plant murderer without wanting to. I killed an aloe vera plant, if that was possible.
Okay.
But,
Cool.
yeah, but I think with that, we open it out to questions, if there are any comments or questions. Okay, in which case we continue our conversations in the weeks to come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nasima.
Yes.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much.